The imperial capital of Hanyang was burning. Thick, suffocating smoke choked the night sky, turning the moon the color of rusted iron. From the grand courtyard of the palace, I could hear the terrifying sounds of slaughter, the clash of steel, the splintering of ancient cedar doors, and the agonizing screams of the royal guard. I knelt on the polished wooden floor of the great hall, my royal silk handbox stained with soot and the blood of my loyal servants. I was Princess Ryu-hwa, the emperor's fourth daughter. For 20 years, I had lived as a ghost in my own home, neglected by my father, bullied by the royal noble consort, and entirely forgotten by the court. I had kept my head down, hoping that compliance would buy my survival. I was wrong. Silence does not protect you from wolves, it only makes you an easier meal. The heavy paper doors of the hall were violently kicked open. A dozen rebel soldiers stormed in, their swords dripping with fresh blood. Stepping through the wreckage, wearing the dark red guanbok robes of a high official, was Prime Minister Choi, the man who had smiled at my father's banquets for a decade. He looked down at me, his eyes filled with a cold, mocking pity. "Where is the emperor?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite my desperate attempt to hold it steady. "His Majesty has already ascended to the heavens, Princess," the Prime Minister sneered. "A tragic illness, I assure the historians, just as the Crown Prince suffered a fatal fall from his horse an hour ago. The dynasty has rotted from the inside, Ryu-hwa. I am simply pruning the dead branches." "General Baek will slaughter you for this," I spat, gripping the edge of my skirt. "When the Black Tiger cavalry reaches the capital, your head will spike the city gates." The Prime Minister let out a slow, chilling laugh. He reached into his wide sleeve and tossed a heavy object onto the floor. It rolled to a stop at my knees. It was a shattered bronze tiger tally, the military seal of General Baek Hyeon, the empire's most fearsome and loyal commander. It was soaked in dried blood. "The Invincible Demon of the North is dead," Choi whispered, his smile widening. "Poisoned in his own command tent 3 days ago. Did you really think I would strike the head of the dragon without first cutting off its claws?" My breath caught in my throat. The general was dead, the absolute shield of our dynasty, the only man who had never bowed to the Prime Minister's gold, was gone. The empire truly was lost. "End her," Koi commanded, turning his back on me. A soldier stepped forward, raising his heavy broadsword. I didn't close my eyes. I stared directly at the Prime Minister's retreating back, a hatred so profound and absolute burning in my chest that it felt hotter than the fires consuming the palace. If the heavens had given me just one more chance, I thought, as the cold steel descended toward my neck, I would not have hidden. I would have bathed this court in their own blood. The blade struck. There was a blinding flash of white light, no pain, only a sensation of falling backward through an endless, suffocating void. Then, I gasped. Air flooded my lungs. It didn't smell like smoke or copper. It smelled of cheap pine incense and damp earth. I shot upright, my hands flying to my neck. No blood, no wound. My skin was perfectly intact. I was sitting on a hard, unheated ondal floor. The room was small, drafty, and poorly lit by a single flickering oil lamp. The worn, faded folding screen in the corner was unmistakable. This was the moonlit orchid pavilion, the dilapidated quarters I had been banished to during my teenage years. "Your Highness? Princess Ryu-hwa? Are you having a nightmare?" I snapped my head toward the sliding door. My personal maid, Yeon, was peeking into the room holding a basin of water. Her face was young, unscarred, and full of life. Yeon had died defending my chambers during the rebellion, taking an arrow to the chest. Yet here she stood. My mind raced, the sheer impossibility of the situation threatening to fracture my sanity. I scrambled to my feet, rushing to the small bronze mirror resting on my vanity. The face staring back at me was younger, the baby fat still clung to my cheeks. My eyes were wide and terrified, not hollowed out by years of royal neglect. "Yeon," I rasped, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What is the year? Tell me the exact year and the month." She looked at me as if I had gone mad. "It is the 10th year of the Emperor's reign, Your Highness, the month of the plume blossom. Tomorrow is the grand banquet celebrating the end of the northern border skirmishes." The 10th year. I let go of her and stumbled backward. The rebellion happened in the 15th year. I had not just survived a nightmare. The heavens had actually listened. I had been thrown exactly 5 years into the past. 5 years before my father was poisoned. 5 years before the Prime Minister launched his coup. And most importantly, exactly 1 day before General Baek Hyeon, the loyal general, the Invincible Demon, was scheduled to return to Hanlong to attend the royal banquet. I looked back at the bronze mirror. The frightened, neglected girl was gone. In her place was a woman who knew the exact shape of the empire's grave. "Yeon," I said, my voice dropping the trembling pitch of a child and adopting a cold, unbreakable resolve. "Go to the royal armory, bribe the quartermaster if you must. I need a map of the northern garrison routes, and I need the finest silk robes hidden in the storage. The era of the invisible princess ends tonight." The grand banquet hall of the palace was a sea of excess. Hundreds of silk lanterns bathed the intricately painted wooden beams in a warm golden glow. Courtiers in vibrant blue, green, and crimson robes drank sweet plum wine, laughing loudly at the jokes of men they secretly despised. Music from a dozen stringed gayagum drifted through the air, masking the venomous whispers of palace politics. In my previous life, if I attended these banquets at all, I sat at the very back. I would wear muted, faded colors, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on my lap while my half-sisters paraded their wealth, and my father, the emperor, looked right through me. Not tonight. When I stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the chatter near the entrance died instantly. I did not wear the pale, forgettable fabrics of a neglected fourth daughter. Thanks to Yeon's successful bribe at the royal storage, I wore a sweeping, magnificent dangui of deep, blood-red silk, heavily embroidered with the golden crest of the imperial family. My hair was piled high in an elaborate chignon, held perfectly in place by a heavy jade binyo hairpin. I kept my spine perfectly straight, my chin leveled, and my eyes completely cold. I walked down the center aisle of the hall not as an afterthought, but as a predator stepping into a cage of very plump, very blind rabbits. Murmurs rippled through the hall like a sudden wind over a field of wheat. Ministers leaned in, hiding their shocked whispers behind painted fans. Even my father, seated high on his golden throne, paused with his wine cup halfway to his lips, his brows knitting together in confusion. I took my seat near the front, a place reserved for high royalty that I had never dared claim before. Across the aisle sat Prime Minister Choi. He looked exactly as he had the night he ordered my death, slick, arrogant, and brimming with unearned power. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second. I offered him a slow, perfectly polite smile. He blinked, clearly unsettled by the sudden, sharp intelligence radiating from the girl he had written off as a simpleton. But the Prime Minister was not my target tonight. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the entire hall. The sweet music of the gayagum abruptly halted. The heavy entrance doors opened again, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. General Baek Hyeon had arrived. He did not wear the colorful, delicate silks of the court. He wore a dark, heavy martial chelik coat over black iron scale armor that still bore the faint metallic scent of blood and northern snow. He was a towering, imposing figure. A jagged silver scar cut across the left side of his jaw, a brutal souvenir from a barbarian warlord. His eyes were like chips of black ice, scanning the room with the paranoid, lethal calculation of a man who lived entirely on the battlefield. This was the Invincible Demon, the shield of Joseon, the man whose death in 5 years would spell the end of our dynasty. As he strode down the aisle to pay his respects to the emperor, the nobles physically shrank back, terrified of the sheer, suffocating aura of violence he carried. In my past life, I had been terrified of him too. I had hidden my face behind my sleeve when he walked past. Tonight, I watched his every move. After a terse, rigid bow to my father, the general did not join the ministers. He retreated to a shadowy alcove near the open terrace, standing with his back to the wall, holding a cup of clear rice wine that he did not drink. He trusted absolutely no one in this room. I waited until the music resumed and the court was sufficiently distracted by a troupe of dancers. Then I stood up, smoothed my crimson silk skirts, and walked directly toward the darkest corner of the hall. As I approached, General Baek's hand subtly drifted toward the hilt of the sword belted at his waist. His cold eyes locked onto me, warning me to turn back. I ignored the warning. I stepped into the alcove, entirely isolating us from the rest of the party. The capital's wine is too sweet for a man used to the bitter cold of the Yalu River, isn't it, General? I asked, my voice low and steady. He stared down at me. Up close, his presence was overwhelming. Princess Ryu-hwa, he said, his voice a deep, gravelly rumble that sent a slight shiver down my spine. You are standing dangerously close to a man the court considers a rabid dog. Are you lost? I am exactly where I intend to be, I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. I came to offer my condolences. His eyes narrowed to dangerous slits. My men won the border campaign, Your Highness. We suffered few casualties. I have nothing to be condoled for. I am not speaking of the border, General Baek, I whispered, stepping half a pace closer so only he could hear me over the music. The 3 crates of grain your northern garrison received last month from the Ministry of Revenue, the grain that was quietly mixed with river sand to artificially inflate its weight, while the surplus silver lined Prime Minister Choi's pockets. The air between us snapped tight. The general's hand gripped his sword hilt so hard his knuckles turned white. It was a military secret he had just discovered, a deeply guarded insult that could spark a civil war if spoken aloud. How do you know that? He demanded, his voice dropping to a lethal, barely audible whisper. I don't have spies, General. I have open eyes, I said smoothly. The Prime Minister is slowly starving your army to weaken your grip on the north. He fears your sword, and he should, but a sword is useless if the arm swinging it is starving. General Baek studied my face, searching for the terrified, invisible princess the rumors had painted me as. He found nothing but a reflection of his own ruthless pragmatism. Why are you telling me this, Princess? He asked slowly. What game are you playing? No game, I said, my eyes flashing with the memory of the burning capital. I am building a wall to keep this dynasty from collapsing into ash. You are the strongest stone I have. Meet me at the abandoned Lotus Pavilion by the Eastern Gate at midnight. Bring no guards. Come alone. Without waiting for his answer, I turned my back on the most dangerous man in the empire and walked away, melting back into the sea of colorful, doomed nobles. The bait was set. Now I just had to see if the demon would bite. The Eastern Lotus Pavilion had been abandoned for years, ever since the late Empress passed away. The wooden planks groaned softly under the chill midnight wind, and the dark, unmoving water of the pond reflected a sliver of the crescent moon. It was a place of ghosts, forgotten by the palace guards and ignored by the sweeping brooms of the gunyeo, the court maids. It was the perfect place to commit treason. I stood at the edge of the pavilion, wrapped tightly in a thick, fur-lined durumagi coat to ward off the biting spring cold. I didn't bring a lantern. The darkness was my only shield if the Prime Minister's spies were roaming the grounds. For nearly an hour, there was nothing but the sound of the wind rattling the dry lotus husks. Doubt began to gnaw at the edges of my mind. Had the demon of the north decided I was a foolish child playing dangerous games? Would he report my treasonous whispers to my father? Then the shadows behind me moved. There were no footsteps, no crunch of gravel. One moment I was alone, and the next a massive, suffocating presence filled the small wooden pavilion. If this is a trap, Your Highness, you are standing much too close to the edge of the water. A deep, gravelly voice murmured right behind my shoulder. I forced myself not to jump. I slowly turned around. General Baek Hyeon stood there, fully enveloped in a black traveling cloak, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his longsword. His eyes pierced through the gloom, dissecting every shadow in the pavilion to ensure we were truly alone. If this were a trap, General, I would have brought the Capital Defense Forces, not a single hairpin, I said, keeping my voice calm and even. He stepped fully into the pale moonlight. The silver scar on his jaw looked even more menacing in the dark. You spoke of stolen grain and the Prime Minister's corruption, he stated, skipping all royal formalities. You are the Emperor's fourth daughter. You have no political backing, no mother's clan to protect you, and you have spent your entire life hiding behind paper screens. Yet you speak like a spy master. Explain yourself, Princess, before I leave you to the cold. I took a deep breath. The scent of frost and cold iron radiated off his armor. He was terrifying, but he was my only way out of the ashes of my previous life. I am a ghost in this palace, General, and ghosts hear everything, I said, stepping closer to him. You think your greatest enemy is the barbarian horde across the Yalu River, but your true enemy sits across from you at the banquet tables, smiling while he slowly bleeds your army dry. The Prime Minister isn't just stealing your grain, he is preparing to sever the Emperor's military power completely. Baek Hyeon's jaw tightened. The Prime Minister is a greedy rat, but he is a coward. He would not dare move against the northern garrison openly. Not openly, I countered, locking my eyes onto his. Next week is the royal spring hunt. The Emperor will ride into the southern forests, and you, as the honored guest, will ride at his right hand. The Prime Minister has bribed the imperial gamekeepers. During the chaos of the boar hunt, a stray, unmarked arrow will strike your horse. When you fall, another will find your throat. It will be recorded as a tragic hunting accident. The general went completely still. The silence stretched between us, thick and lethal. He was a master of tactics, and I could see his mind racing, evaluating the terrain of the upcoming hunt, the positioning of the guards, the plausibility of the assassination. Why would a forgotten princess risk her life to warn a warlord? He asked, finally, his voice dropping an octave, filled with genuine, dangerous suspicion. What is your price, Ryu-hwa? I don't want a reward, General. I want an alliance, I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. The Prime Minister will kill you to weaken the throne, and once you are gone, he will slowly poison my father and slaughter the imperial family. I refuse to be a lamb waiting for the slaughter. I reached under my heavy coat and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. I opened it and held it out to him. Inside rested a flawless, solid gold imperial seal, not the Emperor's orchestrates, but my own royal stamp, validating my bloodline and my absolute royal authority. I need your swords, General. I need your terrifying reputation, and I need the impenetrable wall of your northern garrison, I said, looking up at the giant of a man. And you need royal legitimacy. You need an unshakable connection to the imperial family, so the Prime Minister can never legally cut your supply lines or declare you a rogue commander again. Baek Hyeon looked from the gold seal to my face. A look of sheer disbelief washed over his hardened features. You are proposing a political alliance between the royal family and a common-born military dog. The Emperor would never allow it. The court would riot. The court will choke on their outrage, and the emperor will agree if you demand it as your reward for your border victories, I shot back, stepping entirely into his personal space, refusing to be intimidated by his towering height. "Marry me, General Baek Hyeon," I said, the words hung in the freezing air, sharp as a blade. "Marry me," I repeated, my voice fierce and unyielding. "Give me your army, and I will give you the royal mandate. Become my husband, and I swear to you on the spirits of my ancestors, I will personally hand you the head of the Prime Minister on a silver platter." The Invincible Demon of Joseon stared at me. For a moment, the hardened, cold warrior looked completely taken aback. Then, slowly, the corner of his scarred mouth twitched upward into a dark, terrifying smirk. He didn't see a naive princess. He saw a comrade in arms. He saw a woman willing to burn the court to the ground to survive. He reached out, his large, calloused, leather-gloved hand gently closing over my small hand holding the gold seal. "If you are lying to me, princess," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark promise, "I will not need an arrow to end your life." "If I am lying, General," I whispered back, "I will gladly let you use your sword." The morning assembly, the joseon, was held in the grand expanse of the Gunjang-jeon, the main throne hall. The air was thick with burning sandalwood and the quiet, nervous shifting of 100 ministers dressed in their formal gwanbok robes. I was not permitted to stand among the men. As a princess, I watched from behind a heavy bamboo screen to the side of the royal dais, a silent phantom observing the court. Through the thin slats of bamboo, I had a perfect view of my father, the emperor, sitting high on his throne wearing his crimson dragon robes and the black silk Ikseongwan crown. And I had a perfect view of Prime Minister Choi, standing at the head of the civil officials, looking utterly complacent. He believed he held the entire empire in the palm of his hand. Then, the massive wooden doors swung open. General Baek Hyeon strode into the throne hall. He had not changed into the soft silk robes expected for a royal audience. He still wore his black iron scale armor, the metal clinking sharply with every heavy, deliberate step. He looked less like a subject coming to pay respects and more like a warlord coming to collect a debt. The ministers parted for him like water breaking around a jagged rock. Baek Hyeon stopped at the base of the royal steps and dropped into a crisp, rigid kneel, bowing his head exactly the required amount, no more, no less. "General Baek," the emperor's voice boomed, echoing off the high painted ceiling, "the invincible demon of the north, you have pacified the Yalu River border and brought glory to Joseon. The throne owes you a great debt. Speak your desire. Do you wish for 1,000 acres of fertile land in the southern provinces, or perhaps the title of Chief Military Commissioner?" Behind the bamboo screen, I held my breath. My nails dug so hard into the palms of my hands that I nearly drew blood. If he backed out now, if the Prime Minister's gold or the Emperor's titles tempted him, I was a dead woman walking. General Baek raised his head. His cold, dark eyes did not look at the Emperor. They flicked, just for a fraction of a second, toward the bamboo screen where I was hiding. "I have no use for southern lands, Your Majesty, as my sword belongs to the frozen north," the general's gravelly voice rang out, cutting through the vast hall with absolute authority. "And I have no desire for empty court titles. I ask for only one reward." "Name it," the emperor commanded generously. "I ask for the hand of the fourth princess, Her Highness Ryu-hwa, in marriage." The silence that slammed into the Gunjang-jeon was absolute. It was as if all the air had been violently sucked from the room. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then the court erupted. Ministers broke rank, shouting in outrage. The strict decorum of the morning assembly dissolved into sheer, panicked chaos. A common-born military commander, a man considered a necessary but savage beast by the refined nobility, daring to demand royal blood? It was unprecedented. It was insulting. It was a brilliant, flawless checkmate. "Preposterous!" Prime Minister Choi bellowed, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple as he stepped out of line. The smug complacency was entirely wiped from his features, replaced with genuine, unmasked panic. "Your Majesty, this is an insult to the imperial bloodline. A rough border dog cannot mate with a dragon. Princess Ryu-hwa is delicate. She cannot be sent to the frozen wastelands." Choi was terrified. He wasn't trying to protect me, he was trying to protect his coup. If the absolute military might of the northern garrison merged with the legitimate, divine bloodline of the imperial family, General Baek Hyeon would become legally untouchable. Choi's plan to isolate and assassinate him would turn to ash. The emperor raised a hand, and the shouting instantly died down, though the tension vibrated in the air like a plucked bowstring. My father looked down at the kneeling giant, his expression unreadable. "General Baek," the emperor said slowly, measuring his words, "you ask for a heavy prize. The princess is of royal blood. And I have spilled my blood for a decade to keep that royal blood sitting on that throne, Your Majesty," Baek Hyeon replied smoothly, his tone bordering on treasonous arrogance, yet completely undeniable. "I ask for only one thing, only Her Highness." The emperor looked toward the prime minister, seeing the sheer panic in the man's eyes. My father was not a fool. He knew the prime minister's faction was growing too powerful. Giving his most terrifying, loyal general a royal tie would create a massive, immovable counterweight in the court. "The heavens reward those who defend the empire," the emperor declared, his voice echoing with finality. "The marriage is granted. The royal astrologers will set a date before the first snow." Behind the bamboo screen, I let out a long, trembling exhale. A slow, dark smile spread across my face. Prime Minister Choi stared at the back of General Baek Hyeon's head, his eyes burning with a desperate, murderous rage. I knew exactly what Choi was thinking. He could not let this marriage happen. He had to accelerate his timeline. The assassination could not wait for the wedding. The trap at the Royal Spring Hunt was no longer just a possibility, it was a guarantee. And this time, the demon and I would be waiting for them in the woods. The Royal Spring Hunt at the base of Mount Acha was traditionally a festival of life, a chance for the nobility to shed their heavy court robes and display their martial prowess. The air smelled of crushed pine needles, damp earth, and roasting meats. Colorful silk tents dotted the clearing, and the deep, resonant blast of the traditional horn echoed through the valley, signaling the start of the games. I sat in the raised pavilion reserved for the royal women, wearing a deep emerald riding darumagi. I held a cup of warm tea, my hands perfectly still, but beneath the silk, my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Down in the clearing, the emperor sat astride his white stallion, surrounded by his elite royal guards. Riding directly at his right hand was General Baek Hyeon. He rode a massive, terrifyingly calm black warhorse. He wore a dark leather chelik, designed for maneuverability, and a massive composite gakgung, a traditional hornbow, was slung across his broad back. He didn't look like a man riding to his death. He looked like a wolf who had just smelled blood. Not far away, Prime Minister Choi sat in the spectators' stands sipping his wine. He looked incredibly relaxed. In my previous life, this was the exact moment he had smiled at me, just minutes before a panicked rider burst from the tree line to announce the tragic accident that had badly injured the general. The hunting horn blew a second time. The emperor spurred his horse forward, and the hunting party thundered into the dense, shadowy canopy of the pine forest. The waiting was pure agony. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The court ladies around me giggled and gossiped, completely oblivious to the empire-shattering violence unfolding in the woods just beyond their sight. Prime Minister Choi casually checked the sun, a smug, anticipating gleam in his eyes. He was waiting for the scream. He got one, but it wasn't the scream he was expecting. A sudden, terrifying flock of crows burst from the tree line, cawing wildly into the sky. Then came the unmistakable sharp clash of steel hitting steel, not the thud of an arrow hitting a wild boar, the sound of men fighting for their lives. The royal guards left behind in the clearing immediately drew their swords, forming a defensive ring around the pavilions. The court ladies shrieked. Prime Minister Choi stood up, a look of profound, sudden confusion washing over his face. This wasn't the plan. It was supposed to be a silent, untraceable arrow from the shadows. Then the heavy thundering of hooves shook the ground. Bursting from the dark tree line was not a riderless black horse. It was General Baek Hyeon. He was riding at a full, terrifying gallop. His leather coat was splattered with fresh crimson blood, and his dark eyes were burning with a lethal fury. But he wasn't alone. Tied to the saddle horn of his massive horse by a thick hemp rope was a man being dragged violently across the dirt. The general pulled hard on the reins, his horse rearing up with a deafening neigh right in the center of the camp. The dragged man rolled to a pathetic, groaning stop at the base of the emperor's viewing stand, covered in mud and his own blood. The emperor, who had been evacuated back to the camp by his forward guards seconds earlier, stood up, his face pale with shock. "General Baek, what is the meaning of this madness? You were ambushed?" General Baek swung down from his horse. He didn't look panicked. He looked like a god of war who had just stepped out of a slaughterhouse. "Forgive the interruption of your hunt, Your Majesty," Baek Hyeon said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that carried across the dead silent camp. He walked over to the groaning, bleeding man on the ground and viciously kicked him onto his back. The assassin was dressed in unmarked black cloth, but his mask had been torn away. He had a brutal, jagged wound across his shoulder where Baek's sword had easily bypassed his defense. "It seems the boars in this forest have learned to forge iron and shoot from the trees," Baek Hyeon mocked coldly. He reached into his belt and threw a heavy, steel-tipped arrow right at the emperor's feet. "4 men fired on me from the high branches. I killed 3. I brought you the one who missed." The emperor stared at the arrow. It was not a standard hunting broadhead. It was military-grade, armor-piercing bodkin point, designed specifically to penetrate iron-scale armor. "Assassins," the emperor whispered, his eyes widening in horror as he realized the royal hunting grounds had been compromised. I looked at Prime Minister Choi. The blood had completely drained from his face. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the wooden railing to stay standing. General Baek noticed. He turned his head slowly, his cold, predator's gaze locking directly onto the trembling Prime Minister. "This rat claims he is a nameless mercenary," Baek Hyeon announced, his voice carrying clearly to Choi's ears. He stepped on the assassin's wounded shoulder, drawing a muffled scream from the man. "But my northern interrogators are very persuasive. Give me 1 night with him in the dungeons, Your Majesty, and I guarantee he will sing the name of the man who paid him to aim at the emperor's right hand." It was a brilliant, terrifying bluff. The assassin hadn't talked yet, but Choi couldn't know that. If the man broke under torture and named the Prime Minister's covert faction, Choi and his entire bloodline would be executed for high treason before sunrise. "Take him to the capital tribunal," the emperor ordered, his voice shaking with absolute rage. "I want to know who dared to strike at my general." As the royal guards dragged the weeping assassin away, General Baek turned back toward his horse. But before he mounted, he looked up at the women's pavilion. His eyes found mine through the sea of terrified nobles. He didn't smile, he didn't nod, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. It was an acknowledgement. The invisible princess had been right. I had just saved his life, and in doing so, I had officially unleashed the demon upon my enemies. I offered him a tiny, almost imperceptible tilt of my chin. The Prime Minister was now a desperate, cornered animal. The silent war had just turned loud. The deepest cells of the Uigumbu, the Royal Investigation Bureau, smelled of damp earth, rusted iron, and decades of silent agony. It was not a place where men went to find justice. It was a place where they went to be erased. Shortly past the hour of the rat, a single royal guard descended the slick stone steps into the dungeon. He carried a wooden tray with a small, coarse bowl of water. His head was bowed, his face hidden beneath the wide brim of his official helmet. He stopped in front of the iron-barred cell where the captured assassin sat shackled to the wall. The prisoner was bruised and shivering, his eyes wide with the terror of the impending morning interrogation. "Drink," the guard whispered, sliding the bowl through the small gap at the bottom of the bars. "The Prime Minister sends his regards. It will be painless." The assassin let out a pathetic, relieved sob. He reached for the water, knowing that the poison in that bowl was a far greater mercy than the flaying knives of General Baek's northern interrogators. But before the assassin's trembling fingers could touch the clay, a massive, black-gloved hand shot out from the pitch-black alcove beside the cell and seized the guard's wrist. The sound of the guard's bones shattering echoed sharply in the silent dungeon. The guard dropped to his knees, biting back a scream of pure agony. Stepping out of the absolute darkness of the corridor was General Baek Hyeon. He didn't look like a royal guest, he looked like the Reaper himself. "You are 2 hours later than I anticipated," the general rumbled, picking up the spilled bowl and sniffing the remaining drops of liquid. "Wolfsbane and crushed peach pits, a coward's recipe. Tell me, does Prime Minister Choi think I am a fool, or does he simply employ them?" The guard whimpered, clutching his ruined wrist. Baek Hyeon didn't bother interrogating the man. He had exactly what he needed. The Prime Minister had panicked. He had made a desperate, sloppy move in the dark, and in doing so, he had confirmed his guilt without the assassin ever needing to speak a word. The general struck the guard once at the base of the neck, rendering him unconscious. He wiped his leather glove on the guard's tunic, turned, and walked up the stone stairs. He had a wedding to plan. The following evening, the heavy paper doors of my secluded moonlit orchid pavilion slid open without a sound. I was sitting at my low mahogany table, grinding dark ink against a stone slab. I did not flinch when the massive shadow of the Invincible Demon stepped into my chambers. We were no longer playing a game of cat and mouse. We were co-conspirators. Baek Hyeon sat across from me. He reached into his coat and placed a small, dark glass vial on the table between us. "The Prime Minister sent a silencer to the dungeons last night, exactly as you predicted. The assassin is secure, and I have the Prime Minister's man locked in a private cell under my own guard. You were right about the hunt. You were right about the poison." "A dying rat will always bite, General," I said, setting my inkstick down. "Prime Minister Choi is terrified of you, but terror makes men dangerous. He will not stop with a single failed arrow. He will try to block the imperial marriage decree. He will claim the stars are unaligned or that the northern winds portend disaster." "Let him claim what he wants," Baek Hyeon stated, leaning forward, resting his massive forearms on the delicate wooden table. The emperor gave his word in front of the entire assembly. To retract it now would show weakness to the military. The marriage will happen. He looked at me, stripping away the titles and the royal pretense. "You saved my life in that forest, Ryu-hwa. I owe you a debt of blood. But a marriage to the northern garrison is not a fairy tale. I am a man of war. My hands are stained, and my enemies are legion. If you walk down this path with me, there is no turning back to the safety of the inner court." Safety is an illusion built by men who want to keep women quiet. I do not want safety, General. I want power. I want the absolute authority to crush the men who would see this empire burn. I unrolled a long sheet of heavy, unbleached parchment. It was not a standard royal marriage registry. It was a contract of our own making, written in my own hand. "These are my terms," I said, pushing the parchment toward him. "First, you will command the absolute loyalty of your army to me as much as to the emperor. Second, you will not interfere in my political maneuvers within the palace. I will root out Choi's faction in the court, and you will sever their military supply lines in the provinces. We strike as one." Baek Hyeon read the elegant, ruthless calligraphy. A dark, genuine smirk touched the scarred corner of his mouth. He wasn't offended by my demands. He was exhilarated by them. "And my terms, princess," he countered, his gravelly voice filling the small room. "Total honesty. I will not tolerate the hidden daggers and whispered lies of the capital. If we are to be a blade, we must trust the hand that wields it. You handle the venom of the court, and I will handle the slaughter of the battlefield. Betray me, and no imperial title will save you." "A fair exchange," I agreed, without hesitation. I picked up a small silver dagger resting next to my inkstone. Without blinking, I pressed the sharp edge against the pad of my thumb and pulled, drawing a bright bead of blood. I pressed my bloody thumbprint at the bottom of the parchment. I flipped the dagger and offered the handle to him. The Invincible Demon took the blade. He did not hesitate. He drew his own blood, his massive, calloused thumb pressing a dark red seal right next to mine. "The contract is sealed," he murmured, his dark eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, possessive loyalty that had once been reserved only for the battlefield. "You are now under the protection of the northern garrison, princess. Let the prime minister try to take another step in the dark. We will cut off his legs." The alliance was forged. The invisible princess and the rabid dog of the north were officially bound by blood and steel. The prime minister thought he was playing a political game of chess, but he didn't realize I had just flipped the entire board. The royal holier, the grand wedding ceremony, was a spectacle of unimaginable wealth, yet the air in the imperial courtyard felt as brittle as thin ice. I wore the traditional halot, a heavy, sweeping bridal robe of deep crimson silk embroidered with golden peonies and phoenixes. A grand, jewel-encrusted Jaekwon crown sat heavily upon my head, a physical reminder of the royal blood I was tying to a common-born warlord. Standing beside me was the Invincible Demon himself. General Baek Hyeon had traded his iron scale armor for the dark blue and gold ceremonial robes of a high-ranking royal consort. Yet, even wrapped in the finest capital silk, he looked entirely untamed. The silver scar on his jaw caught the sunlight, and the cold, predatory sweep of his gaze kept the entire assembly of nobles in a state of terrified silence. We bowed to the emperor. We drank the ceremonial wine from the two halves of a gourd, officially sealing our fates together. The invisible, forgotten princess was dead. I was now the Grand Duchess of the North. The true battlefield, however, was not the ceremonial altar. It was the grand banquet that followed. Inside the royal reception hall, the court feasted. I sat perfectly upright beside my new husband, watching the ministers play their parts. Prime Minister Choi was a master of the mask. He sat near the emperor, smiling warmly, raising his cup, and acting exactly like a loyal servant celebrating his sovereign's joy. But beneath that smile, I knew his chest was tight with panic. Toward the end of the feast, tradition dictated that the high ministers offer their personal blessings to the royal couple. Prime Minister Choi stood up, holding a cup of sweet plum wine. He walked to the center of the hall, his silken robes trailing behind him. "To Her Highness, the new Grand Duchess and our esteemed General," Choi's voice carried over the quieted hall, dripping with a sickeningly sweet condescension. "May your union be fruitful, though it brings me great sorrow to see our delicate princess sent to the frozen, barren wastelands of the north. We find comfort in knowing she will always carry the warmth and the wealth of the capital in her heart." It was a veiled insult, a reminder that I was being banished to the freezing edge of the world, far away from the true power and wealth of Hanyang. General Baek's eyes narrowed, a muscle feathering in his scarred jaw as he prepared to speak, but I gently placed my hand over his beneath the table. "My turn," I signaled. I stood up. The heavy crimson silk of my halat rustled loudly in the silent hall. I picked up my own cup of wine, smiling a smile so sharp it could have cut glass. "Your words move me, Prime Minister," I said, my voice ringing out with a commanding clarity that the court had never heard me from before. "In fact, it is your unparalleled generosity that truly warms the frozen north today. Your wedding gift to the northern garrison has left my husband and I entirely speechless." Prime Minister Choi blinked. The mask slipped for a fraction of a second. He hadn't given a wedding gift to the Northern Army. He had actively been trying to starve them. "Gift, Your Highness?" Choi asked, a subtle edge of caution creeping into his voice. "Indeed," I said smoothly. I gestured to Yen, my loyal maid, who stepped forward carrying a silver tray. Resting on it was a thick stack of heavy, sealed parchment documents. I picked up the top document and turned to face my father, the emperor. "Your Majesty," I announced, projecting my voice so every noble in the room could hear the trap snapping shut. Prime Minister Choi, in his boundless, selfless devotion to the empire's security, has spent the last 5 years secretly surveying the deep southern mountains. He has discovered 3 massive, unregistered silver veins. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Unregistered silver mines were the ultimate imperial crime. All silver belonged to the throne. To mine it secretly was high treason, punishable by the extermination of 3 generations of the offender's family. Choi's face turned the color of old parchment. He froze entirely, the wine cup trembling violently in his hand. "Rather than burden the royal court with the logistics," I continued, my voice dripping with weaponized innocence, "the Prime Minister privately secured the land deeds using his own family's aliases, and today, to celebrate my marriage, he has formally signed all 3 of these incredibly lucrative silver mines over to the northern garrison to fund our border defenses." I held the forged deeds high. They were flawless. My underground network had spent weeks tracking down the paper trail of Choi's illegal black market wealth, compiling the exact locations and dummy names Choi used to hoard his stolen silver. I looked directly into Choi's terrified, bulging eyes. I was holding a loaded crossbow to his head in front of the entire imperial court. If he denied gifting the mines to me, he would have to explain why his family's aliases were on the deeds of illegal, treasonous silver operations. The emperor would launch an immediate investigation, and Choi would hang. But if he agreed with my story, he would instantly lose 80% of his shadow fortune. All the black market silver he used to bribe ministers, hire assassins, and fund his impending coup would be legally transferred into the hands of General Baek Hyeon. The silence in the hall was agonizing. The emperor looked from the deeds in my hand to the prime minister, his eyes narrowing with deep, dangerous suspicion. Is this true, Prime Minister? You discovered unregistered silver and kept it from the throne to gift to the military? Choi opened his mouth. He looked at me, realizing with absolute soul-crushing clarity that the neglected, invisible princess had completely outmaneuvered him. He was trapped in a cage of his own greed. Choi choked out, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, beads of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. He bowed his head low, forced to swallow the poison I had just poured down his throat. Yes, Your Majesty, he admitted. It is a humble contribution to our brave soldiers. A magnificent display of patriotism, I praised loudly, clapping my hands together. I turned to General Baek. The Invincible Demon was staring at me, a look of profound, dark awe in his eyes. He realized exactly what I had just done. I hadn't just secured funding for his army. I had financially crippled the most powerful man in the empire without drawing a single drop of blood. Did you hear that, my husband? I asked, a wicked thrill racing through my veins. The Prime Minister has paid for our swords. General Baek stood up, his massive frame towering over the hall. He raised his wine cup toward the trembling, defeated Prime Minister. The smirk on the general's face was terrifying. The northern garrison accepts your generous tribute, Prime Minister. Rest assured, every ounce of that silver will be forged into steel, and we will remember exactly who gave it to us. They drank. The court burst into nervous, bewildered applause. Prime Minister Choi collapsed back into his seat, his empire of bribes crumbling to dust in his hands. The wedding feast continued, but the war had officially begun, and I had just drawn first blood. The journey to the northern garrison took 14 grueling days. As we left the paved, bustling streets of Hanyang behind, the world shifted. The vibrant greens and gentle breezes of the capital gave way to jagged granite peaks, ancient pine forests, and a wind so sharp it felt like shattered glass against the skin. I did not ride in a luxurious enclosed silk gama. I insisted on riding a horse wrapped in heavy furs, keeping pace with General Baek's vanguard. By the time the massive black stone walls of the Black Tiger Fortress loomed out of the mist near the Yalu River, my hands were numb, my lips were cracked, and every muscle in my body ached. But I did not complain, not once. As the heavy iron gates of the fortress swung open, the courtyard was lined with thousands of hardened, battle-scarred soldiers. They fell to their knees as their general rode in, but their eyes darted toward me with intense skepticism. To them, I was a delicate, pampered flower from the capital, a political burden their beloved commander was forced to carry. They expected me to stumble. They expected me to weep from the bitter cold. I dismounted my horse without assistance. I kept my spine perfectly straight, ignoring the agonizing stiffness in my legs, and walked beside my husband with the absolute, unwavering dignity of a Grand Duchess. That night, I was escorted to the general's private quarters. It was nothing like the lavish, silk-draped pavilions of the palace. It was a fortress command room, austere, built of thick timber and stone, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and weapon oil. A large map of the border was pinned to the wall, covered with tactical markers. There was only one large sleeping mat on the ondol floor. I stood in the center of the room, shivering slightly as the residual chill of the journey finally caught up with me. The heavy wooden door creaked open, and Baek Hyeon stepped inside. He had stripped off his heavy iron scale armor, wearing only a dark, simple linen tunic. Without the armor, he was no less intimidating. His chest and arms were corded with muscle and laced with pale, jagged scars, the map of 100 brutal battles. He looked at me, standing rigidly in his austere room. For a long moment, the Invincible Demon didn't speak. He walked over to the iron brazier in the corner and stoked the glowing coals. "You should have taken the carriage, princess," he grumbled, his back to me. His voice was rough, carrying a strange mix of annoyance and something else. "The men would have judged you, but your hands wouldn't be bleeding." I looked down. My knuckles were split and bleeding sluggishly from gripping the leather reins in the freezing wind for 2 weeks. I hadn't even noticed the pain. "If I hide in a carriage, I am a captive. If I ride at your side, I am your equal. Your men will not respect a Grand Duchess who breaks at the first sign of frost, and we need their absolute loyalty." Baek Hyeon turned around, his massive frame dwarfing mine. I instinctively braced myself, the years of palace abuse making me tense at the sudden approach of a powerful man. But he didn't raise his voice, and he didn't cast a shadow of anger. He stopped inches away, reached out, and gently took my trembling, bleeding hands in his. His hands were enormous, rough with calluses, and radiating an incredible grounding heat. The contrast between the lethal warlord who had dragged an assassin through the dirt and the man now carefully inspecting my split knuckles was entirely jarring. "You do not need to bleed to prove your worth to me, Ryu-hwa," he murmured, his thumb lightly brushing across my bruised skin. It was the first time he had used my given name without a title attached to it. The sound of it in his deep, gravelly voice sent a sudden, unexpected warmth blooming in my chest. "I grew up in a palace where my own father wouldn't look at me, General. I am used to bleeding just to survive." His jaw tightened. The silver scar on his cheek caught the dim light of the brazier. He looked at me not as a political chess piece, but a woman who carried scars just as deep as his own, even if hers were hidden beneath silk. Without breaking eye contact, he guided me to the edge of the ondole floor and sat me down. He fetched a small ceramic jar of medicinal salve and a clean linen cloth. Kneeling before me, the commander of the North, the most terrifying man in Joseon, kneeling at my feet, he began to carefully clean and bandage my wounds. The silence in the room shifted. The cold, transactional nature of our marriage contract began to melt, replaced by a quiet, fierce intimacy. "Prime Minister Choi thinks he sent you to your death by allowing this marriage," Baek Hyeon softly said, tying off the linen bandage. He didn't let go of my hand. He looked up, his dark eyes burning with a possessive, dangerous vow. "He thinks the North will break you. He doesn't realize he just gave the dragon its wings. You are safe here. As long as I draw breath, no blade from the capital will ever touch you." For the first time since I woke up in the past, the suffocating knot of anxiety in my chest loosened. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. I had a monster standing in front of my door, and for the first time in my life, that monster belonged to me. But the peaceful moment was shattered instantly. A rapid, frantic pounding hammered against the heavy wooden door of our quarters. "General!" A muffled, panicked voice shouted from the corridor. "General Baek, forgive the intrusion." Baek Hyeon's demeanor instantly snapped back to the lethal commander. He dropped my hand, grabbing his sword from the weapons rack in a single, fluid motion. "Speak, Lieutenant." "It's the Eastern Watchtower, sir," the soldier reported breathlessly through the wood. "We have riders approaching fast under the cover of darkness. But they aren't barbarians, General. They are carrying the imperial banners, and they are hauling siege weapons." My blood ran completely cold. Imperial banners, siege weapons. Prime Minister Choi hadn't just surrendered his silver mines, he had used the distraction of the wedding to mobilize a rogue faction of the Capital Defense Army, marching them north under forged imperial orders. He wasn't trying to assassinate the general anymore. He was trying to wipe out the entire northern garrison while we were celebrating the honeymoon. The harsh, rhythmic crashing of the jing, the massive iron warning gong, shattered the quiet intimacy of our quarters. General Baek didn't hesitate. He was back in his heavy iron scale armor in less than a minute, his face a mask of absolute lethal focus. "Stay here," he ordered, grabbing his long sword. "Bar the door." "I am the Grand Duchess of the North," I said, snatching my thick fur cloak and wrapping it over my silk robes. "I do not hide under the floorboards while my fortress is attacked." He looked at me, a flash of exasperation crossing his features, followed immediately by a dark, approving smirk. He didn't argue. He threw open the door and we ran toward the battlements together. The biting wind whipped at my hair as we reached the top of the massive black stone wall. Below us, the valley was illuminated by the menacing glow of 3,000 torches. It was a rogue division of the Capital Defense Army. At the front of their lines, they were wheeling out 3 massive hwacha, the devastating multi-rocket launchers capable of raining fire upon our wooden gates. Flapping violently in the wind above the enemy commander was the yellow, 5-clawed Imperial Dragon banner. "Archers!" General Baek roared, his voice cutting through the howling wind. "Knock fire arrows! Burn them to the ground!" 1,000 northern bows raised in perfect, terrifying unison. "Wait!" I screamed, grabbing his armored arm. Baek Hyeon turned to me, his eyes burning with battle lust. "They are aiming siege weapons at my walls, Ryu-hwa. I will not let them fire." "Look at their banner, General," I shouted over the wind. "Prime Minister Cho didn't send them to win. He sent them to die. If you fire upon the Imperial Dragon banner, you officially commit high treason. Cho will take the report to my father and legally declare you a rebel. He's forcing you to execute yourself." The general froze. The tactical reality of my words hit him like a physical blow. Cho had woven a flawless political trap: defend the fortress and become a traitor, surrender and be slaughtered. "Then what do we do?" he growled, his hand tight on his sword. "No," I said, stepping past him. "We break their minds." I walked directly to the edge of the stone parapet, standing entirely exposed. The wind whipped my fur cloak wildly around my shoulders. Down below, the enemy commander, a loyal dog of the Prime Minister, raised his sword to order the hwacha to fire. "I am Princess Ryu-hwa, 4th daughter of the Emperor and Grand Duchess of the North." The enemy commander hesitated. The front lines of the Capital Defense Army shifted nervously. They had been told they were suppressing a rogue general, not firing upon a legitimate royal princess. I reached into my robes and pulled out the solid gold imperial seal. I held it high above my head. In the light of the fortress torches, the gold caught the fire, gleaming like a physical piece of the sun. "The orders you carry are forged by a traitor," I commanded, my voice echoing off the granite peaks. "Prime Minister Choi has stolen royal authority. By the power of this imperial seal, I command you to stand down, or your entire bloodlines will be erased for striking at the dragon's blood." The enemy lines wavered. The soldiers looked at each other in sheer panic, but the enemy commander knew he would be executed by Choi if he failed. "She is an imposter!" the commander shrieked desperately. "Prime the hwacha! Fire!" "General," I said quietly, not looking back, "I read the military archives. The capital's black powder is mixed with river clay to save silver. In this freezing temperature, it takes exactly 20 seconds for their fuses to catch before they can launch." Baek Hyeon stepped up beside me. He didn't question how I knew the exact chemical flaws of the enemy's weapons. He just smiled, a dark, terrifying expression. He raised his hand. "Wait for it," he ordered his archers. Down below, the enemy soldiers desperately touched torches to the hwacha fuses. The fuses sparked, sputtering weakly in the damp, freezing northern air. "Now," I whispered. "Fire the trenches!" Baek Hyeon roared. Not a single arrow was fired at the men. Instead, a volley of flaming arrows shot into the empty rocky trench directly beneath the enemy's siege line, a trench that Baek Hyeon's men had quietly filled with pure, unadulterated northern pitch earlier that week as a standard defensive trap. The trench erupted. A massive wall of fire shot into the sky, creating an impenetrable wall of heat and flame right in front of the Hwacha. The sudden extreme thermal shock hit the sputtering frozen fuses of the enemy's siege weapons. The flawed black powder in the Hwacha didn't launch, it detonated. A chain reaction of massive explosions ripped through the enemy vanguard. The siege weapons splintered into burning shrapnel, but because of the firewall, the blast was contained to the weapons themselves. The enemy army was thrown to the ground, terrified, deafened, but largely unslaughtered. When the smoke cleared, the enemy commander was pinned under a broken wheel, and his army was completely broken. They threw their weapons into the dirt and fell to their knees, bowing toward the wall where I stood with the glowing gold seal. They weren't surrendering to the demon of the north, they were surrendering to me. I lowered the seal and turned around. The thousands of battle-hardened northern soldiers lining the walls were staring at me. The skepticism in their eyes was entirely gone. It was replaced by absolute, reverent awe. General Baek Hyeon looked down at me, the flames reflecting in his dark eyes. He sheathed his sword, dropped to one knee right there on the stone battlements, and bowed his head to me. Instantly, the entire northern garrison followed suit, thousands of iron-clad warriors kneeling to their new Grand Duchess. The Prime Minister played his hand, Baek Hyeon rumbled, looking up at me with fierce, possessive pride. Now, my princess, we march on the capital. We did not march on Hanyang. We descended upon it like a black avalanche. 50,000 elite cavalrymen of the northern garrison rode south, their black tiger banners snapping violently in the wind. We did not stop to rest. We did not send messengers ahead. Prime Minister Choi believed his rogue army had slaughtered us in the snow. I wanted him to hold on to that comforting illusion right up until the moment my husband's sword was at his throat. It took us 7 days to reach the capital. By the time the towering granite arches of Gwanhwamun, the main southern gate, came into view, the sky was bruised with the dark purple of twilight. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the final phase of Choi's treason was unfolding. Within the grand walls of the Ginjeongjeon, the throne hall, Prime Minister Choi had finally dropped his mask. Flanked by corrupted members of the Naegemu, the royal guard, Choi stood at the base of the emperor's dais. The loyal ministers were held back at sword point. He was presented a fabricated report that General Baek had rebelled and slaughtered me, and that the rogue army Choi sent had heroically put the rebellion down. Under the guise of national security, Choi was forcing my father to hand over the Oksei, the Grand Seal of State, effectively making Choi the military regent. My father sat on his throne, looking ancient and defeated, reaching with trembling hands for the jade seal box. Choi's lips were curled into a victor's sneer. He had won. Then, the earth outside the throne hall began to shake. It started as a low, rhythmic vibration that rattled the porcelain teacups on the ministers' tables. Then came the deafening, terrifying roar of heavy iron battering rams against the palace's outer gates. Prime Minister Choi whipped his head toward the massive wooden doors of the throne hall, his smug smile instantly vanishing. "What is that? Bar the doors! Protect the emperor!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with sudden panic. He was too late. The towering, iron-reinforced doors of the Ginjeongjeon didn't just open, they exploded inward with a deafening crack of splintering cedar. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the panicked court as the dust settled. Standing in the shattered doorway, silhouetted by the torches of 10,000 northern soldiers filling the courtyard behind us, were the ghosts Choi thought he had buried. I did not wear the delicate silks of a princess. I wore a dark leather riding chelyk, a sword belted at my waist, and my hair tied back in a warrior's braid. Beside me stood General Baek Hyeon, fully encased in his black iron scale armor, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his longsword, his eyes locked onto the Prime Minister with the cold, dead focus of an apex predator. We walked into the throne hall, our boots echoed like a death knell on the polished wooden floor. "Prime Minister," I called out, my voice slicing through the absolute silence. "I apologize for missing the morning assembly. The roads from the north were unfortunately cluttered with the corpses of the traitors you sent to assassinate me." Choi stumbled backward, his face entirely drained of blood. He looked like a man who had just seen a demon rise from the underworld. "Impossible," he wheezed, his eyes darting frantically. You are dead." "I have died once before, Choi," I said, my voice dropping to a lethality-carrying whisper as I stopped at the base of the royal steps. "I found it entirely disagreeable. I do not intend to make a habit of it." "Guards!" Choi screamed, pure hysteria taking over. He pointed a trembling finger at us. "They are rebels. The Northern Army has breached the capital. Kill them!" The corrupted Naegemu guards drew their swords, taking a hesitant step toward us. General Baek didn't draw his weapon. He simply took one massive step forward and unleashed a roar so deafening, so filled with pure, unadulterated bloodlust that the vibrations seemed to shake the paint from the ceiling. "I am Baek Hyeon," he thundered, his voice echoing with the weight of 100 slaughtered battlefields. "Commander of the North and Grand Duke of Joseon, any man who raises steel in the presence of my wife will have his bloodline erased." The corrupted guards froze. They looked at the terrifying giant, then looked at the sea of hardened northern cavalrymen flooding the courtyard behind him. They dropped their swords. The clatter of steel hitting the wooden floor was the sound of Choi's empire crumbling. I turned my gaze to the emperor, my father, who was staring at me in absolute shock. The invisible, forgotten daughter had returned as a conqueror. I reached into my leather coat and pulled out a thick stack of confessions, the signed, blood-stained testimonies of the rogue commander from the siege and the assassin from the spring hunt. I threw them onto the floor at Choi's feet. "High treason," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "Embezzlement of imperial silver, forging the royal mandate, and the attempted assassination of the emperor's blood. The penalty is death by dismemberment and the exile of your entire clan." Choi fell to his knees. The arrogant, untouchable puppeteer of the court was reduced to a sobbing, pathetic mess. He crawled toward the royal dais, begging my father for mercy. "Your Majesty, it is a lie! It is a northern conspiracy!" Choi wept. My father looked down at the man who had secretly poisoned his court for a decade. Then the emperor looked at me. He saw the cold, unbreakable iron in my eyes. He finally understood who held the true power in the room. "Arrest him," the emperor ordered quietly. As the northern soldiers surged forward to drag the screaming prime minister away, Choi made one final, desperate move. He lunged to his feet, pulling a small hidden dagger from his sleeve, and threw himself directly at me. He never made it past the first step. General Baek moved faster than the eye could track. There was a flash of silver, a sickening thud, and Prime Minister Choi crashed to the floor, gasping for air, the general's massive boot planted firmly on his chest. Baek Hyeon's sword was drawn, the razor-sharp tip resting exactly 1 inch from Choi's eyeball. "You dare bear steel at my duchess?" Baek Hyeon growled, his voice vibrating with a dark, violent promise. "I should carve you into pieces right here." "No, General," I said, softly, stepping up beside my husband. I looked down at the terrified, broken man who had ordered my execution in another life. The ghost of my past was finally laid to rest. Blood on the throne room floor is bad luck. Let him rot in the Ugwambo dungeons until the executioner's axe falls. He deserves to know exactly what it feels like to wait for the end. Baek Hyeon smirked, sheathing his sword in one fluid motion. He grabbed Choi by the scruff of his neck and threw him to the waiting guards. The throne hall was entirely silent, save for the dragging footsteps of the defeated prime minister. The corrupted ministers fell to their knees, bowing their heads to the floor in absolute submission. I turned and looked at my husband. The Invincible Demon looked back at me, not with the cold stoicism of a warlord, but with the fierce, undeniable devotion of a man who had found his equal. We had burned the corruption to the ground, and from the ashes a new dynasty would rise. 3 years had passed since the splintered doors of the Gunjeongjeon fell beneath the boots of the northern garrison. Prime Minister Cho did not die a glorious death. He met his end on the executioner's block in the center of the capital, his stolen wealth seized to rebuild the military he had tried so desperately to starve. When his head fell, the rotting roots of his faction were pulled from the earth with it. The empire did not burn. Instead, it was reforged. My father, weary and acutely aware of his own failing judgment, formally stepped back from the daily governance of Joseon. He did not pass the seal to one of my young, easily manipulated half-brothers. He passed it to me. I stood on the highest balcony of the Gyeongho-ru Pavilion, the grand royal banquet hall that overlooked the vast, glittering expanse of the capital. The city of Hanyang was thriving. The markets were overflowing with grain, the northern borders were impenetrable, and the whispers of treason in the court had been entirely silenced by the absolute, terrifying loyalty of the military. I wore the deep crimson and gold dangui of the Grand Duchess, but pinned to my waist was the Emperor's jade seal. I was the true ruler of Joseon. The heavy, unmistakable sound of armored boots approached from behind. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The air shifted, growing warmer, heavily laced with the scent of pine and cold iron. General Baek Hyeon stepped onto the balcony. The Invincible Demon of the North was still the most feared man in the empire, but as he stopped beside me, the lethal hardness in his eyes melted into a profound, quiet reverence. He didn't bow. We had long moved past the formalities of court. Instead, he reached out, his massive, scarred hands wrapping a heavy, fur-lined Duramagi cloak over my shoulders to block the evening chill. "The southern governors have sent their annual tribute," Baek Hyeon rumbled, his deep voice vibrating right beside my ear. "And the northern garrison reports no barbarian movements across the Yalu River. The empire is entirely at peace, my Duchess." "Peace is a fire that must be constantly fed, General," I murmured, leaning back slightly into the solid, immovable warmth of his chest. "But I believe we have finally gathered enough firewood to last a generation." He wrapped his arms around my waist, pulling me flush against his armor. He rested his chin on the top of my head, looking out over the sprawling, prosperous city that we had bled to save. "When you first cornered me in that abandoned pavilion," Baek Hyeon whispered, a dark, amused smile in his voice, "I thought you were a desperate child playing a game of swords. I didn't realize I was marrying the most ruthless tactician in the dynasty." I turned in his arms, looking up at the jagged silver scar on his jaw and the fierce, undeniable devotion burning in his dark eyes. "I told you I would hand you the head of the Prime Minister, and I told you I would save this empire," I said, reaching up to trace the line of his scar, "and I simply needed the monster of the North to help me do it." Baek Hyeon leaned down, his lips brushing against mine in a promise sealed in blood, steel, and absolute victory. "And the monster," he murmured against my lips, "is entirely yours." I had died in the ashes of a fallen dynasty, a forgotten, invisible princess, but the heavens had given me a second chance. I had rewritten the stars, married a warlord, and conquered the very court that had tried to bury me. This time, my story did not end in tragedy. It ended in an empire. The end.